Chapter 9, Part 10, Energy Sources for Muscle Contraction. So you've probably figured out, based on what you've learned so far, that ATP is an important part of muscle contractions. ATP provides the immediate energy for muscle contractions, and it is produced in 4 processes that we'll mention here. The first one is the conversion of 2 ADP to 1 ATP and AMP. So that's a lot of letters. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate, meaning it's adenosine with 3 phosphates. And when we take any of those phosphates off, the first one coming off, it will turn it to adenosine diphosphate, as in 2. And then if you take another phosphate off, it will be adenosine monophosphate, mono being 1. So when we convert 2 ADPs, that's a total of 4 phosphates, then we can convert that into an ATP and adenosine monophosphate. So we need, well, anyway, so the next way that we make ATP is the transfer of phosphate from creatine kinase to ADP, and that will end up making ATP. And basically, the way I describe this usually is saying that creatine kinase is like a placeholder for that extra phosphate. And whenever we need to take to make ATP, if we have ADP handy, then we will pull that extra phosphate off the creatine kinase and form ATP. The third way is through anaerobic respiration, and basically it is a fairly quick process, but makes very little ATP. So it occurs in the absence of oxygen, without oxygen, or very low oxygen, and results in the breakdown of glucose into lactic acid. And that process will yield, like I said, a very low number of ATP. Aerobic respiration requires oxygen for it to work, and that will break down glucose to produce ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. And this is a lot more efficient than the previous way to make ATP, anaerobic. So when you think about it, just remember that aerobic, it does require oxygen, and be very careful when you're reading these words on any of the assessments. This is anaerobic without oxygen, and this is aerobic with oxygen. And so aerobic is going to be the best bang for your buck. It takes longer to make ATP. However, when it's all done and over with, you make quite a few. And depending on the cell, depending on where we're at in the body, you're going to usually get about 36 ATP. I don't know. I think this is a typo, because that should say 36 net gain of that shouldn't say that. That should say 36 net gain of ATP. So again, this is just illustrations of what I just talked about. And this actually happens in the mitochondria. As you know, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, makes ATP. There's ATP made elsewhere as well, as you can see here, but the most ATP that you're going to get is through this aerobic pathway. So as far as what you need to take away from that, by the way, aerobic pathway yields the most ATP. This anaerobic pathway can actually lead to muscle soreness if you're talking about, when you have lack of oxygen there. Oxygen helps to get rid of that lactate, which is lactic acid. And if there's a buildup of lactic acid in your muscles, if you're on a stair stepper and you're, really kind of breathing really heavily, there's lots of parts of your body that needs that oxygen, and your muscles are going to be last to get it. And so your muscles are going to become very sore. And maybe even very painful. And that feeling of painful muscles is caused by that lactic acid buildup in the muscles. And then once you stop working out and you get the oxygen to where you need to in the muscles, then that oxygen will actually remove that toxic buildup of lactic acid in the muscles. All right, so muscle fatigue and soreness. So decreased capacity to work and reduced efficiency of performance is, muscle fatigue. There's different types. There's physiological, which is something that results from a very specific, depletion in ATP, oxidative stress, or inflammation. But then there's also a psychological type of muscle fatigue, and it really depends on the emotional state of an individual. So let's see here. Physiological contracture is a state of fatigue where, due to the lack of ATP, neither contraction nor relaxation can occur. Rigor mortis, and this is what I mentioned earlier in the last or maybe the previous screencast, that lack of ATP is the development of rigid muscles several hours after death. Calcium ions will leak into the sarcoplasm and attaches to the myosin heads, and cross bridges form. And without ATP, those cross bridges will not detach. And so that causes a rigor mortis, a stiffness of the person. And as the tissues start to deteriorate, that will stop, that will go away. All right, and oxygen deficit and excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So oxygen deficit is the lag time between when a person begins to exercise and when he or she begins to breathe more heavily. And then excess post-exercise oxygen consumption is the lag time before breathing returns to normal once the exercise stops. So basically that oxygen deficit must be repaid, and that's why you're still breathing heavy after you stop the exercise. Yeah, so, you get off a stair stepper and, make it all the way to maybe the lockers, and maybe you're still breathing heavy. It's because your body is still repaying that oxygen deficit that you used up. Metabolic processes that restore homeostasis, such as body temperature, ion concentrations, metabolite, and hormone levels, will all help to restore. Those things will help to restore that post-exercise oxygen consumption. So that's it for chapter 9. And I promise chapter 10 is very short. So I know there was a lot of screencasts here for this chapter, but it's a lot of information. So if you have questions, let me know.